In 1856, Texas built its first asylum for one reason: to get the mentally ill out of jail cells. That asylum is still standing. It just reopened as a $305 million facility. Right now, thousands of mentally ill Texans are sitting in those same jail cells, waiting months, sometimes years, for a bed inside it. This is the story of Austin State Hospital, and what went wrong spans 165 years. Before the Civil War, before railroads had even reached Austin, Texas had a problem it did not know how to solve. The mentally ill were locked in county jails and poorhouses, sharing cells with criminals, sleeping on stone floors. There was no treatment. There was no plan. There was just a cage. So, in 1856, the Texas legislature set aside $50,000 in government bonds and authorized the construction of a state asylum on the outskirts of Austin. The site they chose sat miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by open prairie and live oak trees. It was considered the middle of nowhere. Today, it sits 3 miles north of downtown, wedged between one of the trendiest neighborhoods in the city and a street lined with coffee shops. The design followed a philosophy developed by a Quaker surgeon in Philadelphia named Thomas Kirkbride. His idea was radical for the time. He believed mental illness was not a curse or a moral failing, but a condition that could be cured through environment. Large windows for natural light, cross-ventilation for fresh air, spacious rooms arranged by diagnosis, gardens, exercise, and a strict but gentle daily routine. The architecture itself was supposed to be the medicine. Before Kirkbride, the prevailing theory was that mental illness came from demonic possession, and treatments included flogging and dousing patients with ice water. What Texas was building in the 1850s was supposed to be the opposite of all of that. Construction began in 1857. Then the Civil War broke out. Texas seceded from the Union. The building plans were never fully completed. And in May of 1861, the same month Confederate and Union soldiers were killing each other across the South, the Texas State Lunatic Asylum admitted its first 12 patients into an unfinished building in a state at war under a philosophy that promised healing through peace. But there was a problem baked into the foundation from the very first day. Despite everything Kirkbride's plan stood for, including light, air, and dignity, African American patients were housed in the basement. It was the darkest, worst ventilated space in a building whose entire design philosophy was built around light and ventilation. Both Kirkbride himself and the hospital's superintendent objected. It did not matter. This was Texas in 1861, and that basement would remain the designated ward for black patients for nearly 100 years. In the 1930s, the hospital built a separate structure, Building 519, specifically as a dormitory for African American women. Integration did not begin until 1958, and it crept along slowly until 1965. For a full century, the patients who were supposed to benefit from Kirkbride's vision of light and air instead received their treatment underground. By the 1890s, the 12 patients had become almost 700. The asylum had grown into something no one originally planned, a completely self-sustaining village. It had its own dairy farm, its own hog farm, Japanese-style gardens, an ice factory, a tailor shop, a carpenter shop, artesian wells, a creamery, and a mattress factory. The campus stretched over 1,000 acres, with a large pond on the southeastern corner where children from nearby neighborhoods paddled small boats to tiny islands. Families from Austin took carriage rides along the asylum's graveled paths and had picnics under the live oak trees on the grounds. Children explored the gardens and paddled boats to the islands on the pond. It looked like a park. It felt like a retreat. Patients worked the dairy, harvested crops, did laundry, and mopped floors. Some even joined the hospital staff. In 1942, a state dairy and hog farm was established on 300 acres about 17 miles north of the campus. Patients were sent there to work as unpaid laborers. That farm is gone now. The land where the mentally ill milked cows and slopped hogs for no pay is roughly where the Lakeline Mall Home Depot sits today. What those families did not know, what nobody knew for decades, was that directly beneath the grass where they spread their blankets, the bodies of former patients lay in unmarked graves. The asylum had been quietly burying the dead on its own grounds since the 1860s. And when space eventually ran out and a new cemetery was established 2 miles away, the bodies were supposed to be exhumed and moved. But the job was done so carelessly that human remains have reportedly surfaced during routine groundskeeping for over a century. The new cemetery, an 11-acre plot on 51st Street, became the final home for roughly 3,000 people, patients, staff members, and residents of the state school for people with intellectual disabilities. For more than 100 years, their graves were marked not with names, but with small numbered concrete slabs, 4 inches by 12 inches. The reasoning was privacy, so passers-by could not identify someone's relative as an asylum patient. In practice, it erased them completely. Most of those tiny markers have long since sunk beneath the grass. It was not until 1998 that a maintenance director named Dave Rupe decided this had to change. He spent years combing through patient records and old logbooks, building a database of every person he could identify. He insisted that from that point forward, every patient buried in the cemetery would have a name on their headstone, not a number. Rupe himself died in 2012. About 700 of the people buried there have never been identified. Walk past the cemetery today and you see what looks like an empty field between a strip mall and an intramural baseball diamond. There is almost nothing to suggest that 3,000 people are buried under your feet. And in one corner of the cemetery, the southwest quadrant, the hospital's pathologist had been burying leftover body parts from autopsies for years. That practice continued until Waller Creek flooded one year and washed human limbs out of the ground and onto 51st Street. The hospital purchased an incinerator shortly after that. One of the first people laid to rest there was John Neely Bryan. If you are from Texas, you probably know that name. Bryan founded the city of Dallas. He established the settlement on the Trinity River in 1841, sold downtown land parcels for $1 each, and built the cabin that still sits as a tourist attraction in downtown Dallas today. Schools, hospitals, and streets across the city carry his name. What Dallas schoolchildren are never told is how John Neely Bryan actually died. By 1874, his mind had deteriorated. His son testified in court that his father's lucid moments lasted only minutes at a time, that he talked foolishly, became furious, tried to fight, tried to burn his bedclothes, and tried to break through the walls of his own house. In February of 1877, Bryan was committed to the Texas State Lunatic Asylum. He died there 7 months later. His body lies somewhere in the southeast quadrant of the cemetery, in a grave that was unmarked for over 120 years. A memorial headstone was finally placed near his approximate burial location in 2006, but no one actually knows the exact spot. The man who built one of the largest cities in America ended his life as a patient number in a lunatic asylum, buried in a grave his own descendants could not find. If you are from Texas and you had no idea the founder of Dallas spent his final days in this asylum, or if you have ever driven past that cemetery on 51st Street without knowing 3,000 people were buried under that empty field, drop that in the comments. Because what happened inside this hospital over the next century makes everything so far sound like the good years. Somewhere in a storage closet at the University of Texas, there are glass jars filled with formaldehyde. Inside those jars are human brains removed from the skulls of patients who died at Austin State Hospital. There used to be about 200 of them. Half have vanished. And one of those brains may have belonged to the most infamous mass shooter in Texas history. But that story starts decades earlier, in the wards of a hospital that was already falling apart. The 1918 influenza pandemic hit Austin State Hospital so hard that nurses and attendants either died or fled in terror. The patients, the people supposedly too ill to care for themselves, were forced to run the wards. They cooked, they cleaned, they tended to each other. The people society had locked away became the only ones willing to stay. World War II made everything worse. Staff shortages, supply shortages, funding that never came. By the 1940s, the hospital had nearly 3,000 patients and a medical staff that consisted of one superintendent, one assistant, 9 doctors, and a single dentist. That is 12 medical professionals for 3,000 severely mentally ill human beings. And the treatments had changed. The early days of gardens and fresh air gave way to practices the original designers of this hospital would not have recognized. Electroconvulsive shock therapy was used extensively, not just as treatment, but reportedly as punishment for patients who refused to comply. Doctors strapped patients to tables and sent jolts of electricity directly into their brains, sometimes multiple times a week. And for patients deemed beyond the reach of medication or therapy, there were lobotomies, procedures where a surgeon would drill into the skull or slide an instrument behind the eye socket to sever connections in the frontal lobe. Patients who survived were often left unable to speak clearly, unable to control their own bodies, staring at the walls of a ward they would never leave. Prior to the 1950s, the overwhelming diagnosis handed to patients at Austin State Hospital was schizophrenia or mania. The hospital resisted psychotherapy for years. Electricity and surgery were faster. And those windows Thomas Kirkbride designed to let in healing sunlight and fresh air were sealed shut because too many patients were using them to kill themselves. The building that was designed to cure through its environment had become a place where the environment itself had to be locked down. By the 1960s, over 3,300 patients were crammed into the facility at its absolute peak. The introduction of psychotropic drugs and the civil rights movement's push for community care triggered a slow emptying of the wards. The population dropped to under 2,000 by 1970. By the 1980s, fewer than 500 lived on site. As of 2019, Texas ranked 49th in the entire nation for mental health funding. A hospital worker who spoke anonymously to a reporter described patients living in buildings more than 80 years old that had not seen major renovations in half a century. And something else had been happening behind those crumbling walls that would not come to light for decades. Beginning in the 1950s, a staff pathologist named Coleman de Chenard began collecting the brains of deceased patients during autopsies. If a patient died with any kind of brain disorder or intellectual disability, the brain was removed, placed in a glass jar filled with formaldehyde, labeled with a case number and condition, and added to a growing collection. Over the next 30 years, de Chenard accumulated roughly 200 preserved human brains. Then, on August 1, 1966, a 25-year-old engineering student named Charles Whitman climbed to the observation deck of the University of Texas clock tower, less than 2 miles from the asylum, and opened fire on the people below. He killed 17 and wounded 31 in 96 minutes of shooting. It was one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history. In a note written the night before, Whitman had requested that his brain be autopsied after his death. The man who performed that autopsy was Coleman de Chenard. He found a pecan-sized tumor pressing against Whitman's amygdala, the part of the brain that processes emotion. The tumor's exact role in the massacre was never definitively established, but Whitman's brain was reportedly preserved and added to de Chenard's collection, sitting on a shelf among 200 other brains in the same hospital where patients had been lobotomized, shocked, and buried without names. De Chenard died in 1985. A year later, the hospital tried to offload his collection. Harvard and Yale offered money for it. But the administrators wanted the brains to stay in Texas, so approximately 200 specimens were transferred to the University of Texas at Austin. About half went to a psychology professor's lab. The other half were placed in a basement storage closet in the Animal Resources Center, and then everyone forgot about them. In 2011, a photographer named Adam Voorhees stumbled onto the collection while visiting the University of Texas to shoot a brain for a magazine. He found roughly 100 jars in the closet, misshapen brains, unusual sizes, strange colors. He and a journalist spent months investigating. What they discovered made national news. Approximately 100 of the original brains were simply gone. Nobody could explain where they went. The University of Texas eventually admitted that in 2002, staff had destroyed 40 to 60 jars as biological waste. But that did not account for all of them. To this day, no one knows the full story of what happened to every brain Coleman de Chenard pulled from the patients of Austin State Hospital, including, possibly, the brain of the University of Texas tower shooter. For more than 20 years, one of the doctors on that children's unit was sexually abusing his patients. And the hospital knew. In 1990, a psychiatrist named Charles Fisher came to work at Austin State Hospital. His patients were adolescent boys with severe mental illness. Over the next 2 decades, Fisher systematically abused the most vulnerable children in his care. He met with them alone at night in the aging brick wards of the hospital campus. He locked his office door with patients inside. Multiple boys reported the abuse over the years, and the system did nothing because the accusers were psychiatric patients. Their own diagnoses were used to discredit them. Hospital administrators reviewed complaints and let them go. A culture built inside those crumbling state hospital walls that was supposed to protect the most vulnerable instead protected the professional who was hurting them. Fisher was finally indicted in 2012 and convicted of 11 felonies, including sexual assault of a child. The trial forced the state to confront a systemic failure. More than 500 surveillance cameras were installed across 10 state hospitals. Abuse tracking databases were created, and investigation records that had previously been destroyed after 5 years were now kept for 20. But for the boys whose accusations were ignored for 2 decades, those reforms came far too late. Today, the Austin State Hospital campus looks almost nothing like it did for most of its existence. A gleaming $305 million facility opened in May of 2024 with single-occupancy rooms, private bathrooms, courtyards, a gym, and natural light flooding every hallway. The original 1857 main building still stands as a historical landmark, its thick limestone walls and Italianate facade watching over a campus that has been almost entirely rebuilt around it. During construction, workers dug into the earth and pulled out artifacts from another century. Buttons, jewelry, ceramic fragments, farming tools, horseshoes, and silverware, spoons and forks with 3 words still legible on the handles after more than 150 years. Austin Lunatic Asylum. But here is where the story circles back to where it began. The new hospital has 240 beds. That is actually fewer than the average daily census of the facility it replaced. And, as of 2024, Travis County alone had 85 people on a wait list for those beds. The longest wait, 253 days. More than 8 months sitting in a county jail cell, without a trial, without treatment, waiting for a psychiatric bed to open up. Statewide, the wait list for Texas state psychiatric hospitals peaked at over 2,500 people in December of 2022. The average wait for a maximum security bed stretched to nearly 700 days, almost 2 full years. In 1856, Texas built its first asylum because the mentally ill were being warehoused in jail cells with no treatment, no plan, and no hope. 165 years, 3,000 buried patients, 200 collected brains, and $305 million later, the mentally ill in Texas are back in jail cells, waiting. The architecture has changed, the philosophy has changed, the money has changed. But the question that the 6th Texas legislature tried to answer in 1856 was this: what does a society owe to the people it cannot cure? That question has not changed at all. And Austin State Hospital, the oldest psychiatric facility west of the Mississippi, is still trying to answer it. If you are watching from Texas, or if your state has a similar story buried just beneath the surface, tell us about it in the comments. And if this is your first time on this channel, we cover the hidden histories of institutions like this one every single week.